I moved in to help my son, and by the next morning, I was given a chore list like I was there to earn my stay. I didn't say anything when Ashley slid the paper across the kitchen counter, her nails tapping lightly against the granite as if she were handing me something completely normal, something expected, something I should have been grateful for. The morning light was coming through the tall windows, soft and golden, catching the dust in the air, and for a moment, everything looked peaceful enough to pretend this wasn't happening. I had arrived the night before with 2 suitcases and a heart full of purpose, telling myself I was doing what any mother would do, stepping in when her son needed help after his back injury, making sure he wouldn't have to struggle alone in a house that suddenly felt too big for him to manage. I had even stopped at the grocery store on the way, filling my cart with his favorite things, the cereal he loved as a boy, the brand of coffee he never changed, the soup he used to ask for when he was sick. I thought I was coming home in a way, not to my house but to my role, to the place I had always held in his life, the one where I made things easier, softer, safer. But that paper in front of me told a different story. I picked it up slowly, smoothing the edges between my fingers as if the words might rearrange themselves into something kinder if I gave them enough time. Laundry daily. Meals family only. Dishes immediately after use. Floors twice a week. Bathrooms once a week. It wasn't the list itself that stung. It was the tone, the absence of anything that sounded like a request, or even a conversation. There was no "can you help?" No "would you mind?" No acknowledgement that I had come here out of love, not obligation. Just a quiet expectation written in ink, as if I had already agreed to terms I had never been offered. I glanced up at Ashley, but she was already pouring herself coffee, her back turned to me, moving through the kitchen like this was routine, like this was how things worked now. Daniel was sitting at the table, scrolling through his phone, his shoulders slightly hunched, and for a second I waited for him to look up, to say something, to laugh it off, to tell me this was just Ashley being organized or practical or whatever word he might choose to make it sound harmless. But he didn't. He just said, "It's temporary, Mom." Without lifting his eyes, like that explained everything. Temporary. I repeated the word silently, folding the paper once, then again, placing it beside my plate as carefully as I would have placed a napkin. Temporary could mean anything. Few days. Few weeks. Or something much longer that no one planned to admit out loud. I took a sip of my coffee, even though it had already gone cold, and stared at the list again. There was a time when Daniel used to call me just to ask how long to cook pasta or whether he should add salt before or after the water boiled. There was a time when he would sit at my kitchen table and tell me about his day, every small detail, like nothing in his life made sense until he said it out loud to me. I had held that version of him in my mind all the way here, packing it carefully alongside my clothes, believing that underneath whatever had changed, he was still that boy. But sitting there now, in a house that didn't feel like it had room for me, I realized something quietly, without anger, without even surprise. I hadn't been invited here to help. I had been placed here to serve. And the most unsettling part wasn't the list in my hands. It was how normal they both seemed, as if this arrangement had been decided long before I ever walked through the door, as if the role I thought I was stepping into had already been rewritten without me. I woke up before anyone else the next morning, not because I had to, but because I had always been the kind of woman who woke early when something did not feel right, as if my body refused to rest when my mind was still trying to make sense of things it did not want to accept. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that does not feel peaceful but hollow, like a place that has decided you are only passing through. I stood in the kitchen for a moment, looking at everything as if I were seeing it for the first time, the stainless steel appliances, the spotless counters, the careful arrangement of things that were not mine. I opened the refrigerator and saw the groceries I had bought the day before, already rearranged, my items pushed to one side as if they had been sorted into a separate category, something temporary, something not fully part of the household. I closed the door slowly and reached for the coffee maker, measuring out the grounds the way I always had, but even that felt different here, like I was borrowing someone else's routine. When Ashley came downstairs, she did not seem surprised to see me there, as if she had expected me to already be working, already fitting into the outline she had drawn for me. She glanced at the sink, then at the counter, her eyes moving quickly, quietly checking what had been done and what had not, and I realized she was not seeing me, not really, she was seeing the list. "You do not have to start so early," she said, but her tone did not match the words, and she reached past me to place a dish in the sink without rinsing it, as if leaving it there was part of an unspoken system I was supposed to understand. I nodded without answering because I did not trust my voice yet, and I poured a second cup of coffee I did not need, just to give my hands something to do. Daniel came down a few minutes later, moving slower, his back still stiff, and for a brief moment, I saw the boy he used to be, the way he leaned slightly toward the kitchen as if he knew I would be there, the way his shoulders relaxed when he smelled coffee. But it disappeared quickly, replaced by something more distant, something careful. He thanked Ashley for breakfast before it was even made, then looked at me and gave a small smile that did not quite reach his eyes. "You are settling in okay?" he asked, like I was a guest, like I had not raised him in a house where he never had to ask that question. "I am fine," I said, and I meant it in the way people mean it when they have already decided not to complain. The rest of the morning passed quietly, but not comfortably. I followed the list without thinking too much about it, folding laundry that was not mine, wiping counters that were already clean, moving through the house like I was trying not to leave a trace of myself behind. Every now and then I would pause, not because I was tired, but because something inside me needed a moment to catch up with what was happening, to process the slow shift from being needed to being used. Around noon, I heard a small voice behind me. "Grandma, are you busy?" It was Emily, standing in the doorway with her hair slightly tangled and her socks mismatched, holding a book in her hands. I smiled, the first real smile of the day, and shook my head. "I am never too busy for you," I said, setting the dish towel aside. She stepped closer, lowering her voice like she was sharing something important. "Mom says you are here to help so she can rest more," she said, glancing toward the stairs, "like the nanny we had last summer." I felt something settle in my chest, not sharp, not sudden, but steady, like a truth finally finding its place. I nodded slowly, brushing a strand of hair away from her face. "Is that what she said?" Emily nodded, then smiled again, already moving on to something else, already pulling me into her story about the book she was reading, about a girl who found a hidden door in her house. I listened, I really did, but part of me stayed with those words, turning them over quietly, not with anger but with clarity. Because now I understood something I had not fully seen before. This was not a misunderstanding. It was not a moment. It was a role. And I had been written into it long before I ever arrived. That afternoon, I found myself standing in the hallway longer than I needed to, holding a folded towel in my hands and listening to the quiet sounds of a house that did not quite include me, the low hum of the dishwasher, the faint creak of footsteps upstairs, the distant murmur of Ashley's voice on the phone. I had already finished everything on the list for the day, every task checked off, not because I felt obligated, but because I wanted to understand what it meant to live inside expectations that were never spoken out loud. I moved carefully, deliberately, placing things back exactly where I found them, leaving no sign that I had touched anything, as if I were practicing how to exist without being noticed. When Daniel came into the kitchen later, he paused for a moment, looking around as if something felt different but he could not quite name it, and I watched him from across the room, waiting to see if he would recognize the absence of effort rather than the presence of it. "Everything looks great, Mom," he said. But there was a hesitation in his voice, like he was searching for the right tone, the right distance. I nodded and dried my hands slowly, folding the towel with care before setting it down, giving myself time to decide whether to say what was already forming in my mind or let it pass like everything else. "Daniel," I said quietly, and he looked up, surprised by the sound of his name spoken that way, not sharp, not soft, just steady. "When you asked me to come here, what did you think I would be doing?" He blinked, caught off guard, and for a moment I saw him struggle, not with the answer, but with the realization that there was one. "Helping," he said finally, and I let the word sit between us for a second, long enough for it to feel as vague as it sounded. "Helping with what?" I asked, not accusing, not even curious, just asking the question as plainly as I could. He shifted his weight, glancing toward the stairs, toward the space where Ashley usually appeared when conversations turned uncertain. "Just around the house with things, until I am back on my feet," he said, and I nodded again because I did know I knew exactly what he meant and what he did not say. Helping had become something else, something measured, something tracked, something written down in ink and handed over like a set of rules. I did not push him further. I did not need to. The silence that followed told me everything he could not bring himself to explain. That evening I noticed something small but important. Ashley left another dish in the sink, Then another, then a third, each one placed there without a glance, without a word, as if the act itself was part of a rhythm I was expected to maintain. I did not move. I stayed where I was, sitting at the edge of the table, my hands folded in my lap, watching the pattern unfold without stepping into it. Minutes passed. The dishes remained where they were. Ashley walked through the kitchen again, her eyes going straight to the sink, and I saw it then, the flicker of confusion, the break in expectation. She did not say anything at first, just stood there for a moment longer than usual before turning back toward the living room. It was a small thing. Almost nothing. But it shifted something in the room, something invisible but undeniable. For the first time since I arrived, I was not reacting. I was observing. And in that quiet pause, I realized something that settled deeper than any hurt I had felt so far. This house did not run on kindness. It ran on assumption. And assumptions only worked when no one questioned them. I leaned back slightly in my chair, listening to the soft clatter of a toy dropping in the next room, Emily laughing as she picked it up again, and I let the moment stretch just a little longer than expected. I did not argue. I did not explain. I simply stayed still. Because sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is stop moving exactly where someone expects you to. I did not touch the dishes that night, not because I could not, but because I wanted to see what would happen when I stepped out of the rhythm they had quietly assigned to me, the one that kept everything running without anyone having to acknowledge who was doing the work. The house felt different as the evening settled in. Not louder, not colder, just slightly off balance, like a clock that had missed a beat and had not quite caught up yet. I sat in the living room with Emily, listening as she read aloud from her book, her voice soft and careful, stumbling over longer words and looking up at me for reassurance that she was doing it right. I nodded each time, smiling in the same way I always had, because that part of me had not changed, the part that showed up for her, that made space for her, that listened. But behind that calm, something else was moving, something quieter, something steadier. When Ashley walked into the kitchen again, I could hear the shift in her steps, the pause when she reached the sink, the silence that followed when nothing had been done. She stood there for a moment longer than necessary, and I could almost feel her thinking, recalculating, adjusting to something that did not fit her expectation. "Margaret," she called out, her voice controlled but slightly sharper than before. "Did you forget the dishes?" I looked up from Emily's book slowly, marking the page with my finger before closing it. "No," I said simply, my tone even, not defensive, not apologetic, just clear. That was all I offered. No explanation, no excuse. Just the truth in its smallest form. The silence that followed stretched across the room, thin but noticeable, and I saw the way Ashley's posture stiffened, the way her shoulders squared as if she was preparing for something that had not yet happened. Daniel appeared in the doorway a moment later, drawn by the shift in tone, his eyes moving between us, searching for context, for a way to step in without choosing a side. "What is going on?" he asked, but his voice was already careful, already measured, like he knew the answer would not be simple. "Your mother did not finish what was on the list," Ashley said, not looking at me, addressing him instead, as if I were not part of the conversation that was about me. I watched him absorb that, watched the slight tension settle into his face, the familiar conflict between comfort and confrontation, between what was easy and what was right. "Mom," he said, turning toward me, "it is not a big deal, but it just helps if everything stays consistent right now." I held his gaze for a second longer than usual, long enough for him to feel it, long enough for something unspoken to pass between us. "Consistent," I repeated quietly, and the word felt different when I said it, heavier, more defined. I stood up then, smoothing my hands against my sides, not in a gesture of submission, but of clarity, grounding myself in the moment. "Daniel," I said, my voice still calm, still controlled. "When you were a child, consistency meant I made sure you were fed, safe, and cared for, no matter how tired I was, no matter what I had to do to make that happen." He looked at me, really looked at me this time, and I saw the flicker of recognition, the memory of a different kind of consistency, one that had never needed to be written down. "This," I continued, glancing briefly toward the kitchen, toward the sink, toward the list that had started all of this, "is something else." I did not raise my voice. I did not argue. I simply named the difference. And in doing that, I felt the shift fully settle inside me, not as anger, not as resentment, but as something far more steady. Awareness. Because once you see something clearly, you cannot pretend you do not. And I was no longer pretending. The next morning, I did not wake up early, not out of defiance, but because I no longer felt the need to arrive before everyone else and prepare a day that had already been decided for me. I came downstairs at my own pace, taking each step slowly, listening to the familiar sounds of the house beginning its routine without me, the clatter of dishes, the low hum of conversation, the quiet rhythm of a life that had been moving along just fine before I arrived and, apparently, would continue to do so without needing my constant presence. When I entered the kitchen, Ashley was already there, standing by the counter with her coffee, her eyes lifting briefly before settling back on her phone, as if acknowledging me required no more than a glance. The sink still held a few dishes from the night before, not many, just enough to notice, and I saw the way her gaze flicked toward them for a fraction of a second before she looked away again. I did not move toward them. Instead, I poured myself a cup of coffee and sat down at the table, folding my hands around the mug, letting the warmth settle into my palms. Daniel looked up, surprised to see me sitting instead of moving, and for a moment, I could tell he was trying to understand what had changed without asking directly. "You are up later than usual," he said, not unkindly, just observing. "I am," I replied, and I left it at that. Emily came into the room a few minutes later, her hair still slightly messy from sleep, her eyes bright as she spotted me. She walked over. Without hesitation this time, climbing onto the chair beside me and leaning her head lightly against my arm, a small, instinctive gesture that felt more honest than anything else in the room. "Grandma, are you staying today?" she asked softly, and I felt the question settle deeper than it should have, not because of what she said, but because of how she said it, as if my presence was something uncertain, something that could change without warning. "Yes," I said gently, brushing her hair back from her face. "I am here today." She smiled, satisfied with that answer, and reached for her cereal, completely at ease in a way the adults around her were not. Ashley set a plate down on the counter a little harder than necessary, the sound cutting through the quiet, and I could feel the tension she was trying not to show, the discomfort of a routine that was no longer unfolding exactly as she expected. "Margaret," she said after a moment, her voice measured, "we usually try to keep things running smoothly in the mornings." I looked at her, meeting her eyes without hesitation, not challenging, not yielding, simply present. "That sounds important," I said, and I meant it, but I did not stand up, I did not reach for the sink, I did not adjust myself to fill the space she was pointing toward. The pause that followed was longer this time, heavier, as if the air itself was waiting to see what would happen next. Daniel shifted in his seat, his fingers tapping lightly against the table, a habit he had when he was uncomfortable but trying not to show it. "Mom has been helping a lot," he said finally, his voice quieter now, less certain, and I noticed that he did not look at Ashley when he said it. It was a small thing, almost nothing, but it changed something in the room. Ashley did not respond immediately, and in that silence I saw it clearly for the first time, not just the expectation, not just the control, but the uncertainty beneath it, the way it depended on everything staying exactly as she planned. I took another sip of my coffee, letting the moment settle without rushing to fill it, and I realized something that felt both simple and profound. I did not need to argue to be heard. I did not need to explain to be understood. I only needed to stop agreeing to something I had never truly accepted. And in that quiet decision, I felt the ground shift beneath my feet, not dramatically, not all at once, but enough to know that I was no longer standing where I had been before. By the afternoon, the house had adjusted to me in a different way, not by welcoming me, but by testing me, as if every small moment was being measured against an expectation I had quietly stepped away from. I moved through the living room slowly, picking up a book Emily had left on the couch and placing it back on the shelf, not because it was on any list, but because it felt natural, because it was the kind of thing I had always done without thinking. But now, even the smallest actions felt deliberate, chosen, no longer automatic. I could feel Ashley watching me in subtle ways, not directly, not openly, but through the spaces between rooms, through the pauses in her movement, through the silence that followed whenever I did not do what she anticipated. Later that day, she walked into the kitchen while I was standing by the window, looking out at the backyard, the grass cut evenly, the patio furniture arranged neatly, everything in its place except for the part of me that did not quite belong. "Margaret," she said again, her voice carrying a firmness that had grown stronger since the morning, We need to be clear about something. I turned to face her, giving her my full attention, not bracing, not resisting, just listening. When you agreed to come here, it was with the understanding that you would help out, she continued, her words carefully chosen, her tone steady, as if she were explaining something reasonable, something fair. I nodded slightly, not agreeing, but acknowledging that I had heard her. And I am helping, I said calmly, my voice even without tension. She exhaled slowly, her patience thinning just enough to be noticed. Not in the way we expected, she replied. And there it was again, that word we, as if Daniel and I were not part of the same side of that sentence. I let the silence stretch for a moment, not to challenge her, but to give the truth space to settle between us. Ashley, I said quietly, choosing her name the way I used to when I welcomed her into our family, when everything felt different. Helping is not the same as being assigned. She did not respond right away, and I could see the shift in her expression, the way she recalculated, the way she tried to place me back into a position that made sense to her. This is how our household works, she said finally, her voice slightly sharper now, less controlled. Everyone contributes. I looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time I did not see authority, I saw structure, something she had built carefully, something that depended on everyone moving exactly where she expected them to. Then everyone should be asked, I replied, not raising my voice, not pushing, just placing the truth gently where it could not be ignored. At that moment Daniel walked in, his presence shifting the air again, his eyes moving between us, sensing the tension without fully understanding it. What is going on now? He asked, but his tone carried something new. Not just discomfort but uncertainty. Ashley turned toward him quickly. Your mother is refusing to follow the routine, she said, her words precise, controlled, as if framing the situation would make it clearer, simpler. I did not interrupt. I did not correct her. I simply stood there, letting him hear it as she said it. Daniel hesitated, and I watched the moment unfold, the space where he could choose to understand or to dismiss. Mom, he said after a second, it is not about refusing, it is just about keeping things balanced right now. Balanced. I let the word settle just like the others before it. Balance requires agreement, I said, my voice still steady, still calm. Not assumption. He looked at me then, more directly than he had since I arrived, and I saw something shift behind his eyes, something small but real, like a memory trying to surface, like a realization he had not fully reached yet. No one spoke for a moment after that. The room held the silence carefully, like something fragile. I did not move to fill it. I did not soften it. I simply stood in it, present and unmoving, and for the first time since I stepped into that house, I felt something return to me, not loudly, not dramatically, but quietly and completely. My place was not something they could assign, and I no longer needed their version of it to know where I stood. That evening, the house did not return to normal, not in the way it used to after small disagreements or quiet misunderstandings, because this was not something that could be smoothed over with routine or silence. It lingered in the air, subtle but present, like a shift no one could quite undo. I noticed it in the way Ashley moved through the kitchen, her steps more deliberate, her movements sharper, as if she were trying to reassert something that had slipped out of place. I noticed it in Daniel too, the way he lingered longer in doorways, the way he watched conversations instead of participating in them, as if he were trying to understand something he had not realized was happening until now. I stayed where I was, not withdrawing, not stepping forward, simply existing in the space without adjusting myself to meet anyone else's expectations. When dinner time came, Ashley prepared the meal as usual, moving quickly, efficiently, not asking for help, not offering any indication that she expected it either, and I recognized that shift immediately. It was not acceptance. It was calculation. She was changing the pattern, testing a new one, seeing how the absence of my participation would affect the balance she had created. I sat at the table with Emily while she talked about her day at school, her voice bright and animated, completely unaware of the quiet tension threading through the room. Daniel joined us a few minutes later, and for a moment it felt almost familiar, the three of us sitting there, the soft clink of plates, the low hum of conversation, but it was not the same because now there was something unspoken beneath it all, something none of us could ignore anymore. Ashley placed the plates on the table without comment, then sat down across from me, her posture straight, her expression composed, but I could see it, the effort behind it, the way she was holding everything in place. We ate in silence for a few minutes, not uncomfortable, but not easy either, until she finally set her fork down and looked directly at me. "I think we need to revisit how things are going to work here," she said, her voice calm but firm as if she had been preparing the sentence for some time. I met her gaze without hesitation. Not challenging, not defensive, just steady. "I agree," I said, and I meant it. That seemed to catch her off guard for a second, the agreement where she might have expected resistance. "Good," she replied, recovering quickly, "because this situation needs clarity." I nodded slightly, giving her the space to continue, not interrupting, not redirecting. "If you are going to stay here," she said, choosing each word carefully, "then there has to be structure. We all have responsibilities." I let her finish, letting the words settle fully before I responded, because I had learned by now that rushing to answer only filled space. It did not change anything. "Ashley," I said quietly, "I did not come here to be part of a system. I came here because my son needed me." The room went still again, not dramatically, but enough to be felt. Enough to make the moment stand out from everything that had come before. Daniel looked up at that, really looked up this time, and I saw something different in his expression, something closer to awareness than avoidance. Ashley did not look away, but her composure shifted, just slightly, just enough to show that the conversation was no longer unfolding the way she had planned. "And he still does," she replied, her tone tightening. "But that does not change how this household runs." I held her gaze for another second, then let it soften, not in surrender, but in certainty. "Then perhaps the question is not how your household runs," I said, "but whether I belong in it the way you think I do." I did not raise my voice. I did not argue. I simply placed the truth where it could not be rearranged. Emily looked between us, her small face confused, sensing the shift without understanding it, and Daniel exhaled slowly, as if something inside him had finally been named. No one spoke after that. The conversation did not end with resolution or agreement, but it did not need to, because something had already changed, something quiet but permanent. I was no longer adjusting myself to fit into their expectations. And for the first time since I arrived, they were the ones who had to decide how to respond to that. The next morning, I did not wait to see how the house would respond to me, because by then I already understood that waiting had never been the problem. It had only delayed what was already there. I dressed slowly, choosing my clothes with the same care I used when I still had my own home, my own routine, my own space where I did not have to think about where I belonged. When I stepped into the hallway, the house felt quieter than usual. Not empty but watchful, as if everything inside it had adjusted to a new pattern that no one had agreed on but everyone could feel. I walked past the kitchen without stopping, past the list that was still resting where I had left it days ago, untouched, unchanged, and for a moment I paused, not to read it again, but to recognize what it had become, not instructions, not expectations, but a line I had already stepped away from. I picked up my purse from the chair near the door, the same place I had set it when I arrived, and I noticed how little I had moved it since then, how little of myself I had actually unpacked into this space. It was a small realization, but it settled deeply, because it meant something I had not fully admitted yet. I had never truly arrived here. I opened the front door quietly, stepping outside into the cool morning air, and for the first time since I had come to this house, I took a full breath without feeling like I had to adjust it to fit someone else's rhythm. The street was still, the kind of stillness that belongs to early hours, where everything feels possible simply because nothing has started yet. I walked down the driveway slowly, not rushing, not hesitating, just moving forward without looking back. When I reached the sidewalk, I stopped for a moment, not because I was unsure, but because I wanted to feel the weight of the decision settle fully before I took another step. I had not said I was leaving. No one had asked me to stay. And yet, everything about the past few days had already made the answer clear. Inside the house, I could hear the faint sound of a door opening, then closing again, followed by Ashley's voice, distant but sharper now, calling my name. I did not turn around. I did not answer. Not because I was avoiding the moment, but because I had already lived through it in 100 small ways. Each time I chose silence over explanation. Each time I chose understanding over confrontation. A few seconds later, I heard Daniel's voice too, quieter, more uncertain, and I felt something tighten briefly in my chest. Not regret, not doubt, just the echo of a connection that had not disappeared, only changed. I kept walking. The rhythm of my steps felt steady, familiar, like something I had always known how to do, even if I had forgotten for a while. At the end of the street, I slowed again, reaching into my purse and pulling out my phone. I scrolled through my contacts until I found a number I had not called in years, one I had kept not out of necessity, but out of memory. My lawyer. My finger hovered over the screen for a moment, not because I was unsure, but because I understood what the call meant. Not conflict. Not revenge. Clarity. I pressed the call button and lifted the phone to my ear, listening to the quiet ring on the other end. Behind me, somewhere in that house, they were probably trying to understand what had just happened, trying to piece together a moment that did not fit their expectations. But for me, there was nothing to piece together anymore. The line connected and I spoke calmly, my voice steady, unchanged. "Good morning," I said. "I think it is time I reviewed some paperwork." I did not go back that day, not after the call, not after the quiet clarity that settled over me the moment I stepped away from that house and into a space where I no longer had to measure my presence against someone else's expectations. Instead, I drove across town to a place I had not visited in years, a small office building with a familiar name on the directory, one that had once been part of my life when things were simpler, when decisions were made together, when my voice had not needed to compete for space. The parking lot was half full, the morning already moving forward without waiting for anyone, and I sat in the car for a moment before stepping out, letting the stillness inside me settle into something steady and intentional. When I walked into the office, the receptionist looked up with a polite smile that shifted into recognition after a second, and I returned it without explaining why I was there, because I did not need to explain it yet, not to her, not to anyone. The meeting itself was quiet, professional, and exactly what I needed. Not emotional, not dramatic, just factual, just clear. Papers were pulled, documents reviewed, names confirmed, and as I sat there listening, I realized something I had not fully allowed myself to see before. I had never lost anything. Not really. What I had lost was the illusion that my place in that house was defined by love alone, that my presence would always be understood without question. But legally, structurally, practically, I still held more than they had ever considered. When my lawyer looked at me and said, "Margaret, your name is still on the original property agreement," I did not react immediately, not outwardly, but inside, something settled into place with quiet certainty. I nodded, not surprised, just acknowledging what had always been true, even when I had chosen not to think about it. The house Daniel and Ashley lived in was not entirely theirs. It never had been. I had contributed to it years ago, not as leverage, not as control, but as support, as a way to help my son build something stable, something lasting. At the time, it had not felt important to hold on to that detail. It had felt natural to give without keeping score. But now, sitting there with the documents in front of me, I understood that what I had given had not disappeared. It had simply been overlooked. When I left the office, I carried nothing visible with me. No stack of papers, no dramatic proof, just knowledge, quiet and complete. By the time I returned to the house later that afternoon, the air inside had changed again, heavier this time, more uncertain. Ashley was in the kitchen, her movements sharper than before, her control thinner, and Daniel was standing near the doorway, as if he had been waiting, not sure for what. They both looked up when I entered, and for a moment no one spoke. I set my purse down calmly, removing my coat with the same steady movements I had always used, not rushing, not hesitating. "Where did you go?" Ashley asked finally, her voice controlled but edged with something else now, something closer to unease. I met her gaze without effort. "Out," I said simply, and then I turned to Daniel. He looked at me differently this time, not avoiding, not dismissing, but searching, as if he sensed that something had shifted beyond what he could see. "Mom," he said, quieter than before. "We were trying to figure out what is going on." I held his gaze for a moment, then nodded slowly. "So was I replied. I walked into the living room and sat down, not because I was tired, but because I was done standing in spaces that did not recognize me. They followed, both of them, not out of authority, not out of control, but because something had already changed, something they could not quite name. I did not raise my voice. I did not accuse. I simply spoke, my words measured, clear, and impossible to misunderstand. "If we are going to talk about how this house works," I said, "then we should start with something simple." I paused just long enough for the moment to settle, for them to listen without interrupting. We should start with who it actually belongs to.